Well, good morning, everybody. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm really sorry I can't be there in Addis with you. I'd much rather be in Addis than in London, but then, again, that's where I am. So today I'm going to talk about incentives for public service delivery, and I'm going to focus on recent evidence from field experiments. Now, the starting point for my talk should be the rather uncontroversial fact that the state plays a very important role in economic growth. And it does so by providing infrastructure in terms of physical capital as well as human capital. And it also provides social protection. All the policies that the state is involved in require people. And ultimately, the success of these policies depend on the motivation and the skills of the people that are involved in them. So today's lecture is about these people and how the state can recruit, motivate, and retain talented workers to implement public policies. So the question that we will ask today is how the state can recruit, motivate, and retain talented agents who implement state policies effectively. And if we want to think about people who work for the state, we have to remember that people choose the jobs that they work in. So people select into jobs according to their preferences, their skills, and the characteristics of the job itself. So there's a fair bit of theory and evidence out there that suggests that individuals who sought into the public sector have stronger pro-social preferences because a lot of public sector jobs are helpful for the rest of the population. So pro-social preference means that they put a positive weight on the utility of others. In other words, in simpler words, they care about other people. At the same time, jobs in the public sector tend to have low material incentives. Things like earnings, performance rewards, career progression tend to be a lot less steep in the public sector than they are in the private sector. At an intuitive level, this makes sense because you either do something because you care intrinsically about what you're doing, or you do it because somebody is paying you to do well. In other words, pro-social preferences and material benefits are substitute motivators. Okay? They do the same job. They make the workers want to do what their organizations want them to do. Okay? So in that sense, they're substitutes. So it's not surprising that if we look at data, these things are negatively correlated. Where you find more motivated people, you also have lower incentives. But this doesn't mean that incentives are doomed in the public sector. So the association of pro-social preferences and low incentive does not tell us whether offering large incentives would be a good idea or a bad idea. On the good side, they could motivate agents to perform better. On the negative side, they could crowd out their intrinsic motivation and reduce their performance. There's a good and a bad side on the recruitment side as well. So incentives could attract talented agents who deliver public service effectively, or perhaps could attract agents with weak pro-social motivation who essentially do the job because of the money. So ultimately, this is an empirical question. In theory, everything is possible. And what I'm trying to do in this lecture is to review some evidence on the effect of incentives. By incentives, I mean wage levels, career progression, performance rewards, and so on the performance of the existing agents in the public sector. That's what I call the effort channel, as well as on the type of agents who engages in service delivery, which is what I call the selection channel. Do performance rewards improve performance? Or in other words, do they do what it says on the tin? Well, we define performance rewards any form of reward. This could be monetary bonuses, it could be promotion, but it could be even more creative things like social recognition or an Employee of the Month award. The important thing is that they are tied to a performance measure. So if you're thinking of the sector where normally performance rewards are used, which is in the sales sector, these things are typically related to measures of sales. If we think of public service delivery, say teachers, performance rewards are normally related to test scores. Let me tell you briefly how these things are supposed to be working. What they're supposed to do is to give workers a stake for the behavior that benefits the organization. So the idea is that even if the teacher doesn't care about students' performance in itself, if his pay or her pay depends on the student's performance, she will care to a larger extent because she cares about pay. The challenges are many and varied. The first is that performance rewards can end up improving the measure without actually improving performance. So coming back to the example of teachers in the classroom, there is evidence from actually a fairly very well-developed country that teachers were giving students sugary drinks before the test. These loaded up the students who did very well on the test without actually having learned anything. The organization, that is the school, wanted to reward the teacher for test scores because test scores should have been a measure of the learning of the students, but in reality what they ended up rewarding was creative ways for the teachers to come up with ways to make the students perform better on the test. So this is one example of a way in which performance rewards can backfire by actually affecting the measure of performance without changing the performance itself. The second way in which they can backfire is by improving incentivized dimensions, that is, dimensions of performance over which people are rewarded at the expenses of others. So for instance, if you reward teachers by test scores, maybe they will spend less time developing the social skills of children that are equally important in the workplace. And the final thing is that performance rewards, by giving a material reward for your effort, can crowd out other reasons for exerting effort. So this is a thought which is quite common in psychology, the idea being that individuals have several sources of motivation to perform a task. So teachers might care about students' learning intrinsically because they care about the students' learning, and also because if the students learn, they get paid more. The idea is that the more weight you put on the second element, the more likely it is, according to theory at least, that the first element gets crowded out. So the intrinsic weight that they give on student success is going to be diminished. Let me tell you something about evidence now, and let me start with the good news, with the success stories. So by and large, performance rewards improve the measure that they reward. So they do exactly what it says on the tin. They reward showing up to school on time, people show up to school on time. So a famous example of this is the so-called camera experiment. This was implemented in the context of informal schools in rural India. And the key problem, forget about the teachers not teaching well, the key problem there was that teachers weren't showing up at school at all. They were paid to show up and they weren't showing up. So what the experiment did was to give all teachers a camera with a tamper-proof feature, and they asked the teachers to take a photo of themselves with the students at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And for every photo that they sent with at least 6 or 8 students, I can't quite remember the number, they would be rewarded a token. Okay? And so the idea is that the more photos they sent in, the more likely they were to get paid. This was an unconditional success. Teachers all of a sudden got paid to come to school, they started coming to school. The optimistic message of this is that actually once they were in school, once you force them to be in school because you reward them by being in school, once they were there, they actually taught. And so students' test scores went up as well. There are other examples in which teachers are better behaved, so they actually show up, but once they show up, they don't do much. In these cases, what people have done is to actually reward teachers by improvement in the test scores of the students. And this turns out to be quite effective. If you reward teachers for test scores go up. And there is a recent field experiments done in Andhra Pradesh that shows that providing incentives is much more cost effective than providing extra resources to the school. So it's not only an effective strategy, but it's also a cost-effective strategy. So what about the crowding out that we were worrying about before? Now, there's a surprisingly large number of papers out there that finds out that incentives have no effect and attributes these to crowding out. But incentives might have no effect for a number of reasons, which is not directly crowding out. In a recent paper with two co-authors, Nava Shroff and Kelsey Jack, we designed an actual empirical test of whether performance rewards crowd out the motivation of agents. And the setting that we were looking at in that paper were agents hired by an NGO to sell condoms in Lusaka, Zambia, so not too far from here. What we find is that intrinsic motivations matter. So we have a way of measuring intrinsic motivation, and we find that highly motivated agents sell more condoms. They do a better job because they care about what they're doing. But in contrast to the crowding out assumption, we actually find that performance rewards crowd in intrinsic motivation. So the effect of performance rewards is higher for those agents that are intrinsically motivated. So this is definitely something that requires more work in understanding how the two sources of motivation can be complements or substitutes. So far for the good news. Let's now move on to the bad news, that is cases in which performance rewards fail to do what they're supposed to be doing. One reason for why they might fail is what I already mentioned, that agents focus on the measure that's incentivized and not overall performance. So this was the example that I gave before about giving students sugar before the test to make them perform better. And there are many other examples along these lines. Now, a solution which is normally proposed to deal with this is to make the incentives really difficult to game. Because this is, in essence, the agents being too clever for their own good, and instead of focusing on performance, finding a way to get the rewards without really doing extra effort. But in many cases, this goes too far the other way. So there is evidence that schemes that are too complex for the agents to understand how they get the reward end up being ineffective. And that's not too surprising. If you don't know what you have to do to be rewarded, you end up doing nothing. There are plenty of systems in bureaucracies especially, where what's rewarded is not actual performance, but is actually sticking to process, or what we call ticking boxes. And there is some recent evidence from Nigeria that suggests that bureaucrats who are rewarded according to the number of boxes that they tick and how well they abide to the process ends up backfiring. Because again, bureaucrats end up focusing on following process at the expense of actual performance. Another recent example is actually the work by Adnan, who should be there somewhere in the audience. And it's a very creative way in which incentives can backfire that comes from Pakistan. This was a beautiful experiment where they collaborated with the tax authority in Punjab to increase collection rates of property taxes. What they did was to provide tax collectors in Punjab incentives as a function of the amount of tax that they collected. Essentially, what this ended up doing was to change the bargaining process between the tax collector and the property owners in a way such that the tax collector now had more to lose by not collecting taxes. So this gave them more bargaining power versus the citizens and made them extract more bribes rather than collect more tax. That was entirely unexpected ex ante, but it was a consequence of the incentive scheme. Finally, again, another recent piece of evidence that comes from Uganda, again nearby here, incentives can actually convey information about the nature of the job and attract wrong agents. So this is an example in which an NGO, BRAC, wanted to recruit community health workers that had two tasks: to sell health products and to do household visits. So it had a commercial aspect and it had as well a public health delivery aspect. Turns out that by offering steeper incentives, people interpreted the job as being mostly about sales, so mostly in a commercial nature. And this attracted people that were interested in sales rather than interested in public service delivery. And these people ended up performing worse. Another Another reason for why incentives might fail is if implementation is poor. And this is particularly important for scale-up, because we often learn a lesson from one policy experiment and then we want to apply that lesson to other contexts. So in a recent paper by Banerjee and co-authors, they used a set of the same people who did the camera experiment that was so successful for teachers, tried to replicate it with nurses, again in India. So they gave nurses the cameras and told them that they would be paid according to the number of valid photos that they would send in. Turns out that the scheme was completely ineffective. As they dig deeper about what had happened, they noticed that the nurses originally were responding to the scheme, but then they started making up excuses, as in, the dog ate my camera, I couldn't take a picture. And whereas the camera experiment with the teachers was implemented by the researchers and researchers didn't fall for any of the excuses, the camera experiment with the nurses was implemented by the government. And the government was more lenient in accepting excuses. So by the end, the incentive scheme had become completely ineffective because both people who sent in the photos and people who didn't all got the same reward. And that, again, is an important point for when we think of scaling up from field experiments which are implemented by researchers to field experiments which then have to be implemented by the governments themselves. Okay, so where does that leave us? Let me give you kind of a general assessment of what we've learned after years and years of field experiments in public service delivery. Well, I think we've learned that performance rewards can be effective as long as these 4 conditions are met. The first is that the performance measures that you use to reward must capture the effect of individual productivity. The second is that they must capture every relevant dimension of the job. The third is that they can easily be affected by the individual. There's no point in rewarding people for things that they cannot change. And the fourth is that they cannot be easily gamed. If not, incentive schemes can be ineffective or also detrimental in the worst cases, like we saw with the property taxing in Pakistan, where he only ended up raising more bribes rather than raising more taxes. So what do we do from here? What do we do in all the cases in which performance rewards are not effective? Well, one way is to look at broader motivators. So not to be so precise about what people need to do and what gets rewarded, but rather reward people by paying a more generous salary or giving them more autonomy. The second way is to focus on selecting the right people. Although it's not clear a priori what right means. Does right means more talented, more prosocial? And do you have to choose? That is there really a trade-off between people who have talent and people who care about helping people in public service delivery? So let me tell you a bit. There is much less evidence on these 3 topics than there is on performance rewards. So let me tell you what we know first about efficiency wages, or in other words, the answer to the question whether higher salaries improve performance. Well, to answer that question, we have to understand why that should be the case. Because after all, salaries are fixed in the sense that they don't depend on performance. So why should I work harder because I'm paid more? There are 2 reasons that people have put forward for why I should work harder. The first is that if the salary is good, it's a well-paid job, it's probably better than any other job I can get, I might be afraid of losing this job if I underperform. The second reason is more behavioral, and is a reciprocity reason. The idea being that the employee might want to reciprocate the employer's generosity. Okay? The evidence on this is very thin, and actually I'm going to break my own rule and I'm going to talk about a natural experiment, mostly because there is no field experiment that has looked at the effect of increasing wages on performance. This experiment comes from the UK. It's a natural experiment where people, my colleague John Van Reenen and Carol Proper, his co-author, were looking at how different nurses had different real wages in England. And the variation in real wages come from the fact that the cost of living varies widely across regions of the UK. So the same wage buys you next to nothing in London, and it can buy you a house and a good drink in the north of England. So that meant that nurses in the north of England, in real terms, have higher wages than nurses in London. They show quite unambiguously that higher real wages are associated with better performance in hospitals, which of course makes me feel a lot better every time I have to go to hospital in London. The question that they can't address is whether this is due to selection or whether it's due to effort. That is, whether the people who work for a higher real wage are better selected, they're more talented, or whether they're motivated by that higher wage and hence they work harder. The second type of motivator that has been analyzed more recently is autonomy. Okay, so the idea is the debate between decentralization and centralization. Centralizations normally applies to rules that are in place to restrict opportunistic behavior. So you don't want your employees to buy a $1,000 chair, so you put in a rule that every chair that your employee buys must cost at most $100. Okay? But at the same time, this limits the use of the agent's private information. Say, for instance, that your manager knows that there is a particular employee who has really bad back pain, and with a $100 chair, they keep getting up to stretch their back. The productivity of that individual will be much higher with a $1,000 chair, but if the manager doesn't have the discretion to purchase that chair, that loss of efficiency will remain. Okay? There is some evidence, scattered evidence, I would say, that points out to the value of discretion. So a while ago, I worked in procurement, and we found out that a lot of inefficiency in procurement is mostly driven by excessive rules. Procurement is an area in which there are lots of rules to curtail corruption, and at least in the case of Italy, which doesn't shine on the corruption indexes, we found that actually these rules were too many, and the excessive rules ended up making procurement less efficient. The second piece of evidence that we have comes from Nigeria, and what the authors Imran Rasool and Dan Rogers show in that paper is that public organizations that give bureaucrats more discretion have higher rates of project completion rates. Okay? And this all comes from survey evidence, as I said, in Nigeria. The third piece of evidence comes from Gujarat in India, where it's been shown that giving discretion to environmental inspectors improves the targeting of firms and results in the same reduction in pollution at a lower cost. By imposing rules that say all the inspectors have to go to all the firms in that 5-mile stretch, inspectors end up going to a lot of firms that don't need inspection. By giving them the discretion to go wherever they think is appropriate, they end up going only when they know that pollution can be reduced. So the final thing that I want to talk about is one stage removed. That is, all of the things that we've been discussing so far look at existing employees and find ways of making existing employees perform better. But what if the answer is to select better employees to start with? What's the role of incentives in affecting performance through selection? So in a recent paper with my co-authors Nava Shraff and Scott Lee, we collaborate with the government of Zambia in the context of their new community health assistant program to run a field experiment that tries precisely to answer this question. Community health assistants are a new cadre that was generated by the government of Zambia in 2010, and the objective of the cadre is to address staff shortages in rural areas by formalizing community health workers' position. Now, the community health assistants work in very remote areas, and it's almost impossible to monitor their performance and to give rewards as a function of precise measures of performance. This is specifically a case in which performance rewards, if you attempt them, are bound to fail. A possible alternative is to offer them career advancement, which comes with salary progression. This career advancement within the civil service can, but does not have to be used as an incentive. Okay? So the aim of the paper is to test how career incentives affect who self-selects into these public health jobs, and through the selection, how they affect their performance on the job. Now, interestingly, this is a beautiful example of cogeneration of knowledge. The reason the project started was because we were sitting in the HR director's office at the Ministry of Health back in 2010, and the HR director asked us this question: what will happen now that they see themselves as civil servants? Will they retain their connection with the community? In other words, the Ministry of Health HR director asked us a question that was of fundamental policy importance for the design of the Community Health Assistance Program, but it was also fundamental importance for researchers working in incentives in organization, because to date, proving the selection effect of incentives had been quite elusive. So what we did, once we found this question that both the policymaker wanted to know the answer to, and we as researchers wanted to know the answer to, we set up the following experiments. We worked in the first phase of the CHA program, where the government was aiming to recruit 2 CHAs from 165 communities. The key challenge, in order to understand what's the selection effect of incentives, is to separate the effect of selection from the effect that incentives have by motivating people on the job. The way we tackle this problem is by exploiting the fact that this is an entirely new cadre. The Ministry of Health had never hired community health assistants before. And because this is a new cadre, the attributes of the job are unknown to potential applicants. In other words, more relevant for this purpose, the potential applicants did not know whether they could have a career in the Ministry of Health or not. So our strategy consisted in varying the salience of career incentives when recruiting agents, and this opens the selection channel because agents know different things about the incentives. But then once agents are recruited, we provide the same incentives to everybody. And this effectively closes the motivation channel because both our treatment and our control group have exactly the same incentives. The way we implement this strategy is by randomizing recruitment posters across 48 districts. Now you're going to see 2 posters on this slide. The 2 posters look very similar, they should do, but there are important differences between the 2 of them. The control poster makes the job look a lot like the existing community health workers. That is, all those people who work on an informal basis, some from NGOs, some completely voluntarily out of the goodness of their heart, and they work to help the community. So this poster, this control poster, really describes the new CHA position as a voluntarily based, community-based, help the people, be a good person kind of job. The second type of poster that we use, that's the treatment poster, makes very precise that the aim of this position is to have a career, that a key benefit from doing this job and applying for this job is that you can have a career in the Ministry of Health. So this is how we create variation in the salience of career incentives, by advertising in a subset of districts the career aspects, whereas keeping those mute in the second set of districts. Now obviously you have to worry about things being different across districts. For all we know, the districts that we ended up choosing for treatment unlikely were richer or poorer, or people were more educated. And all of these are aspects that can affect the success of the CHA job. It turns out that treatment and control districts are similar on most relevant dimensions. So they have the same eligible population to apply for the CHA jobs, and actually only 4% of the population are eligible. And of these, most of them are not using the skills to the best of their opportunities. 13% of them are employed, 8% of them are in housework, 30% of them are self-employed, mostly in farming, and 34% are employees. And if you dig deeper into this fraction of employees, most of them are in low-skill jobs. Okay? The area characteristics are also very similar, and most importantly, they're severely understaffed. There are on average 1.5 people working at the health post. So because the government is sending 2 CHAs to each health post, this program is quite large in terms of increasing the staff in these facilities. The target population in these districts also looks similar along the lines of education, wealth, access to safe water and sanitation. Okay. So what do we find? Well, the first finding is that career incentives really attract a different type of people who end up doing differently once on the job. And to be precise, career incentives attract agents who do 31% more visits. Of course, in the back of your mind, you can think of a million reasons for why number of visits is not a good measure of performance. For instance, well, now you've learned that one potential drawback of incentives is that they provide a lot of incentive on one dimension at the expense of other dimensions. It turns out that that's not the case. Community career incentives workers end up doing better on every dimension of the job. They do more visits and they do more community mobilization meetings in the village. They're also equally likely to remain in their post. So it's not the case that people who are attracted by career incentives escape as soon as you give them a chance. They're still, most of them, in their posts as we speak. It's not the case that they focus on easy-to-reach households. So those hired with the community incentives do not go out of their way to reach hard-to-reach households. They do not do longer visits. They do not target better within households. They do not work longer hours doing something else. And they are not more responsive to emergency. We were understandably excited about these results, and so was the ministry, because we seem to have found a way to recruit people who put in more effort in the job. But of course, ultimately what we care about is not how many households these agents visit, but whether these visits have any effect on health behaviors and health outcomes. So we used the Ministry of Health HMIS data to look at facility utilization. And we showed that in treatment areas, institutional deliveries went up by 31%. I don't need to exaggerate the importance of these results because we all know how important it is for women to give birth in a clinic as opposed to in the house. A lot of maternal mortality can be prevented by giving birth in a clinic with easy access to medical equipment. So the fact that institutional deliveries went up by 30% is an important result that speaks to the effectiveness of these community health workers. It was not just institutional deliveries. The number of children visited at the health post went up by 24%. Children waited went up by 22%. And the under ones receiving polio vaccination also went up by 20%. So this is in terms of facility utilization. Now we want to know whether this then corresponds to health-seeking behaviors by the households and ultimately in health outcomes. So to answer that question, we ran a survey on households in these 47 districts, and we found that in treatment areas, breastfeeding went up. Breastfeeding is recommended for kids aged under 2. It went up by 8%. Deworming went up by 15%. Children on track with immunization went up spectacularly, but that's partly because the baseline levels were very low. So it increased by 81%, it almost doubled in treatment areas. And finally, the bottom line is that all these improved health practices resulted in a diminishing share of children who are underweight. In treatment areas, the share of children underweight is lower by 25%. So what do we learn overall? I think the main lesson is that career incentives attract candidates who perform better and are equally likely to remain in their post. Interestingly, and I haven't shown you this result in the interest of time, but believe me, what we find is that the difference is mostly driven by unobservables. That is, things that the government cannot measure and make part of the criteria for the job. So this points out to the importance of focusing on incentive design at the recruitment stage, because the results cannot be replicated by changing the selection criteria. And the bottom line is that the two main sources of motivation that attract applicants to these jobs, which are the material benefits in the form of career prospects and intrinsic utility due to helping others, do not clash. Let me conclude by drawing some general lessons from what we know and what we still need to find out. I think that economists have made some progress in understanding how to attract, motivate and retain agents in public service delivery. However, still a lot more remains to be discovered, and in particular so in two areas. The first is the trade-off between rules and discretion. Or in other words, does giving autonomy motivate good performance and attract good workers? Or is it effectively signing a blank check? You can ask Adnan about a recent project that we're involved with the government of Pakistan, trying to relax the rules that procurement officers in Pakistan are subject to. And the final point is how to harness pro-social preferences. There's no doubt that agents who engage in public service delivery care a lot about what they're doing and the people that they're helping through delivering public services. But the focus so far in the literature has been mostly negative, that is, on how incentives can conflict with this source of motivation. What remains to be done is to understand how incentives can interact and can leverage pro-social preferences. So much left to be done. Hopefully this will give ideas to the researchers and the policymakers in the audience for new exciting projects. Thank you.